Good evening, folks.
Good evening.
Good to see you all as usual.
And high praises for those who are with us on such fine summer evening.
Yes.
And it's really, really well done.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Julia Budnik, and my co-director is Paul Grantham. And we'll be very grateful if you write a few words about yourself in the chat box. Just let us know where you are in the country, what is your professional background, what setting you're working in. And because we're talking about supervision tonight, what is your relationship with supervision? Are you a supervisor or are you a supervisee? Are you doing it regularly or just in the beginning of your journey as a supervisor? So anything which you think is relevant to this particular topic. Also, what we are very interested in is whether you've done essential supervision skills training with us, because it's a 2-day BPS approved certificate course. And I know that Paul just finished the last 2 days of essential supervision skills. It's part of a BPS approved certificate in clinical supervision. For the psychologists, it actually counts towards registration in, or we'll call it, name it correctly, RAPS, yeah? It's a register, BPS register of clinical supervisors. So it's a very well credited and very well regarded course. So if you've done it with us, can you just mention in the chat box, when did you do it? Have you done it recently? Have you done it quite a few years ago? Or are you planning to do it? Or maybe you are doing supervision and you've never had any training at all. So anything which is relevant to today's topic would be much appreciated. While we are still gathering, as always, I will share my screen with you to take you through some of the practicalities of both certificate and clinical supervision and things which we are doing in the next month and a half, I would say. Okay, as always, we start at SDS homepage, skillsdevelopment.co.uk. Some people are asking me what SDS means. It used to be, we used to call ourselves the Skills Development Service. So SDS is Skills Development Service, and then we shortened it to SDS Seminars. So we start at the homepage, skillsdevelopment.co.uk, and as you can see, in upcoming events right here, the next event we are running is on the 28th of June. I believe it's Tuesday, Paul. Yeah, is it Tuesday?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
28th of June, advanced supervision skills. So for everyone who have done the 2 days certificate in clinical supervision with us, essential supervision skills, this course will take you one level up in your SDS accreditation for supervision. However, if you're a clinical supervisor with experience, or maybe had your supervision training with somebody else, but want to do advanced supervision skills training with us, you still can attend it and you will receive the certificate for this course. So it doesn't, you don't have to do the 2-day course for coming on this advanced supervision skills. If you're interested in that 2-day course on essential supervision skills, this is our most popular course. So we've been running it for quite a while, but don't worry, Paul updates it regularly. And actually the latest update took place, I think in March or April. That was the latest update of the course, and lots of things were changed. So if you want to come to this course, you it's very easy to find. You click on all courses and the first course on the screen will be essential supervision skills. And as you can see, we are not running that 2-day course until October, and it's usually very, very quickly booked up. So if you want to go on that course, 4th and 5th of October, book it now, use early bird discount, and come and join Paul. It is truly a very interesting course. So welcome everyone, and welcome Paul. Today we are talking about clinical supervision. And first thing I want to ask you, even before I ask you about what is clinical supervision, what is the reason of talking about it? It seems like it's been around for so long. Everybody probably by now knows what is clinical supervision and how to do it. So why would we talk about it again and again, Paul?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I think it sort of links in with the, you know, the whole question of what it is, because I'm not actually sure at all that everybody knows what it is. I think that everybody is engaged in it in some particular way. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are clear on what it is. In fact, you know, over the time that I've been involved in working in this particular field, I've been involved in 3 separate large-scale surveys of supervisors and supervisees. And one thing that has repeatedly come up, and I will whisper this, over a period of 30 years, it's come up repeatedly on, well, I say repeatedly on 3 occasions when we conducted this, is that basically the biggest complaint from supervisors is they basically say, well, we think supervision is a good thing because everybody says it's a good thing, and I do it. But if I'm really, really honest, I'm not quite sure why I'm doing it, apart from the fact it's a good thing. And what's really interesting about that, I think, is that I think a lot of people conduct supervision in, obviously they conduct it and they do it in a particular way, which I think is frequently about either the way in which they themselves have been supervised, so it sort of continues in the same pattern, or alternatively, they will conduct supervision in a way which feels like it sits comfortably with their own personality, or maybe their own value system, or whatever. There's actually a striking lack of clarity around the whole thing. You know, there's a striking lack of clarity for people about what it is they should be doing, why they're doing it, apart from very often there's a requirement for things like registration, or their employer or whatever will actually, you know, specify this is the case. There's also the fact, of course, I think that although it's not universal, I think people enjoy it as well. So, you know, I think that, you know, if you're involved in an activity which you feel is of value, you know, no matter how it's conducted, you do it. Even though really when you're sat down and asked exactly why are you doing it and how should you do it, people start getting a bit vague. I mean, there is, just to highlight this issue, because it sort of goes into the next question really, and sort of amplifies this point, I think really well. There is, and I'll say this 3 times because I think it's such an important starting point, there is absolutely no consensus at all about what supervision actually is. There is no consensus whatsoever. There is no consensus whatsoever. Not that you would believe that, by the way, by picking up any book on the topic. You know, practically any book on the topic will speak with confidence and authority about how to do supervision, and will typically specify that there's only one way of doing it. But unfortunately, these books don't agree with each other. And it creates a really, I mean, I think it creates a problem for all sorts of reasons. I mean, I think that, you know, when we invest so much of our time, and in many instances money, in this activity, you would hope there would be clarity about it when there isn't. And it also is, I would have thought, or hope that you would realize, is quite sort of fertile ground for potential misunderstanding and conflict as well. I mean, to take an obvious point here, if supervisor and supervisee come together and they have different expectations, you know, this can be an issue, particularly when folks have got quite radically different views on it. How that comes about is again quite variable, because if you're talking about supervising people in training, they'll take their lead obviously from the supervisor. But you know, when you are talking about supervising someone who has maybe had a number of supervisors or even one previous supervisor, and you step into the role of supervising them, they may well have a different set of expectations than they had previously. I think the other thing to just say, particularly from the perspective of supervisees, is that one of the things that is often not talked about in supervision relationships is the power differential between the supervisor and the supervisee. Now, how that manifests itself is enormously variable, but I think one of the implications of it is that it's quite difficult for supervisees to actually say things like, I don't agree with this, or I'm not quite sure why we're doing this, or you know, what's the purpose of this, or why are we doing it in this particular, I mean, it's just very difficult, I think, from that perspective. I think that there are, well, we'll come back to the issue about whether that's different, whether you're in an employed environment or in a private environment, but I think it crops up potentially in both. So basically, I think there's a lot of confusion around, a lot of confusion about what it is to do, what it's for, how to actually do it, and a multitude of different opinions. And I just as a starting point to be able to conduct supervision more successfully, really, and with you know, a more satisfying result, I think sort of getting some clarity on that is a really important first step.
Okay, so you are running several courses, training courses on supervision. From what I hear, people write books on supervision. I know there's not very many, but they write books.
There isn't.
And as you've just said, everyone will say you should do supervision this way or that way, and supervision means this or that. So what's your approach at the course? Are you doing the same? You're telling people?
No, definitely not, actually. I mean, for the Essential Supervision Skills course, one of the things I make pretty clear at the beginning of the course is if folks are going to be expecting me to tell them how to do it, they're going to be sadly wrong. Because you know there's actually a number of different ways in which you can approach this, and actually the first step is to realize what the boundaries are, because there are boundaries to it, but within those boundaries to make decisions about, in a way, how you divide the thing up, how you choose to implement it and think about it in a way which fits with your circumstances. Now, having said that, there are, when we look at the skills side of things, there are obviously some skills which are specific to particular ways of conducting supervision, and we go through a selection of those. It's not possible to go through them all. But in addition to that, one of the other things that we do in the course is we look at basically skills that can be used by both supervisee and supervisor within supervision, which cut across those different models, so that, you know, in a sense, whatever angle you come at this from whatever angle you make a decision about what it is that you're wanting to get out of this activity, you know, there will be a range of different skills and techniques that you'll be introduced to, and to varying degrees will have an opportunity to practice as well. Again, partly to see, to be honest with you, what fits most comfortably for you. Yeah, there's obviously a limit in what it is that we can do within that 2-day course, which is one of the reasons why we've got the advanced supervision skills 1-day event after that. And there are some particular things, I mean, I'll be honest with you, there's sort of things that I felt were important but didn't necessarily fit in very easily, or where we couldn't spend enough time on them in the 2-day course. So we do spend quite a bit of time looking at how to run supervision groups. I'm quite happy to come back to that issue later on if you want to. We look at supervision groups. We look at supervision using this medium that we're in now. I am increasingly of the opinion that the way in which, for want of a better term, video conferencing is used, both video conferencing between the practitioner and the client, but also video conferencing between the supervisor and the supervisee, has some really important implications. You know, and it has implications from a number of different angles. I mean, for supervisees, you know, I think that most people's training did not tell them how to conduct therapy, for example, through this particular medium. So there's a whole issue here about, you know, if I'm trying to develop my skills in that particular area, then the obvious place to hopefully develop those skills is to find that out in supervision with my own supervisor. So we sort of look at it from that angle. But I'm also quite interested increasingly in the effect that sort of Zoom or Teams has on the nature of conversation generally with people. Because one of the things that strikes me, and I don't know if other people have this sense as well, is that actually I think this particular medium, it lends itself very well to things that are very task focused, which has got a plus to it, can I say? I mean, I think in my experience, a lot of the meetings that I attend now are a lot more focused than they used to be when we would get together in a room. But having said that, there's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of making sense of. There's a lot of things that we talk about, whether that's to clients or whether that is to supervisors or supervisees, which are not about that. You know, I'm not sure what the right term is, but there's this medium doesn't lend itself terribly well to informal conversation at all. And, you know, and what I sometimes call, not so much with clients, but with other professionals, water cooler conversation that might actually occur. And so we partly look at that as well, and how to actually address it. And some of the other sort of very often unconscious negative effects of trying to conduct work through a screen, which I think it's important for supervisors to both be aware of and also in many ways to support their supervisees in doing more successfully. So we look at groups, we look at video, we also look as well at a very sadly neglected area. In fact, if you think there's very little written on supervision, there's even less written on the supervision of supervisors. And so we're going to spend some time looking at that. I do appreciate that these days there are supervisor training courses, although they're not universal, by the way. And one of the things is that professional bodies who have established training courses for supervisors have not made them obligatory in order to supervise. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but their interest gets lost even further over the whole question of the supervision of supervisors. My experience tends on the whole to be that people at some point in their career reach a level of experience or where they feel that they've got quote unquote something to offer, or alternatively they have a formal role in an organization where they are expected or asked to supervise people, and to be blunt with you, they're pushed in at the deep end and are typically left to get on with it. And you know, just as we know, don't we, that, you know, if you are a practitioner and there's just you and the client in terms of the work, that can be a very lonely place, and on occasions quite a scary place to be. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why you know, we have supervision. But I just want to emphasize, I don't think that changes at all. I mean, the nature of the worries change, but actually it can be quite an isolated position to be a supervisor, particularly when you don't really know what it is that you should be doing or how to do it. you're just left to get on with it. So I'll be spending quite a bit of time on that particular topic as well. And it's one of the reasons why we actually do provide supervision for supervisors, because there is such an absence of it. There are some professional bodies that are just beginning to step onto this now, but it's still not that common.
I would like to ask our participants to write in the chat box, probably answer a few questions. First question is, if you're providing supervision to your colleagues, have you had any training in supervision? Not with us, any training before you were asked to be a supervisor. And second question, related to the last point Paul made, if you are a supervisor, are you ever supervised in that position of being a supervisor? You know what I mean? Not your clinical work, your supervision work. Are you getting any supervision as a supervisor? So if you could just very briefly answer those questions in the chat. And also wanted to say, I do have more questions for Paul, but if you have any questions or even any supervision scenarios you would like to check with him, you're very welcome to put your questions in the chat box or put your electronic hand up and ask your question verbally. So questions are invited. It's not just a show of two of us talking. We would very much want you to be involved. So Paul, I would like to come back to the issue of group supervision. Just your opinion, and what does the literature say? Is group supervision effective? Is it as effective as one-to-one supervision? Is it the way forward in terms of saving the resources and time for both supervisors and practitioners? What can you say on that?
Right. Oh gosh, let's sort of wheel that back a bit. I mean, although we look at this in a bit more detail on the course, I think it's only fair to say to begin with that we have not got much research at all on whether supervision itself is effective. So the issue of is group supervision as effective or less effective or more effective than one-to-one? Can I just say we just haven't got much outcome literature anyway about whether the whole thing is effective, according to a whole wide range of different outcome measures, by the way. We'll leave that to one side about why that is, but that's the case. What I suppose my immediate thoughts are on group supervision is I think it's necessary to start off with the recognition that there is no true model of group supervision. So, group supervision has largely evolved out of two issues, really. One issue is there are some people that would see supervision as being primarily what's called formative supervision. So there are some people who see it primarily as a learning, training, stroke teaching experience in some particular way. And because groups are a common format in which to engage in that sort of activity, there's sort of been a default tendency for some people to go towards group supervision for that reason. The other reason is, I hate to say this, is a bit more cynical, which is that group supervision, in terms of its current popularity, without a shadow of a doubt, is about the fact that there are more people needing and wanting supervision than there are actually supervisors to provide it. So in a way, group supervision very often is actually seen as a logistical solution, particularly within organizations, I think. I'll be honest with you, I'm not saying that nothing of value can come out of it, but I think there needs to be a recognition that it's sort of stumbled into. Having said that, I think there are certain things which group supervision, if it is run well, and that's a big if, by the way, and we'll say a little bit more about what it is that sort of determines that later on, but group supervision, if it's run well, I think for what's called formative supervision, which is skill, knowledge development, you know, particularly when it's around case discussion, I think could almost be the method of choice. I would go that far for it. But there are other areas where I think that it's weaker. I think it's, again, I hate to say this, to some extent, you know, whether group supervision should be the method of choice, first of all, has a lot to do with what you see the purpose of supervision being. Secondly, if you see the purpose of supervision being about certain other things, and I can tell you what those, actually I can say what those other things are. So if you see supervision as playing a key role on things like quality control, you know, about whether I'm practicing safely, you know, whether I am practicing in a way which is you know, acceptable to my peers, we've got a lot of evidence that group supervision is not good for this. I'll go back to why on the course, but it isn't. I think for what's called restorative supervision, which is what we would largely see as supportive supervision, addressing basically emotional components and emotional needs, it's a mixed bag, it's quite a complicated thing to answer, because I think there are some issues where groups are, again, the method of choice, but there's other instances where they distinctly aren't. And I don't want to be too negative here, but if anyone's ever been part of a supervision group where basically people are sharing their concerns, but that, for example, you go round and round in circles and you sometimes wonder if this is actually just a moaning shop, for example. Sorry to be so cynical, but if you come across that, you'll know what I'm talking about. Or maybe in other instances where somebody has a particular need, which is very pressing, but to be absolutely frank with you, it's not one that's shared by the rest of the group. You know, it's a mixed bag, really. It depends, and we will unpackage that. The other thing to say is, I think that when you're looking at group versus individual supervision, there has to be an awareness, at the very least, of the fact that these need to address different things. So if both are running, if I'm a supervisee and I am receiving individual supervision, but I'm also receiving group supervision, there are all sorts of interesting boundary questions that come up with that, which we will unpackage and have a look at, and which are really, really important to get some clarity on. And that's clarity, to be honest with you, more than anything else, with the supervisee. You know, I mean, there's lots of issues that can sort of crop up, and which I think very often are actually ignored. You know, if there's no proper boundary setting and negotiation between, for example, two supervisors, one who's offering me one-to-one supervision and another supervisor who facilitates a group, you know, unless there is some agreement on what we are differentially addressing, then it's going to lead to all sorts of confusion. So I, as a supervisee, come to my one-to-one supervisor and I raise an issue and I get some idea about the direction to go in on it. But to be honest with you, I would like a second opinion, and I bring it along to my group, and actually we end up with a different idea. I don't think that's actually helpful. I think that individual and group supervision ought to, if they're going to occur concurrently, I think that they need to have an agreement about having different remits, basically, so you don't end up with conflict or confusion, which can happen. Yeah.
Yes, you've mentioned several times this evening about boundaries and boundary setting. Can you say just a little bit more? Is it the same as ground rules? What do you mean by boundary setting? How supervisor and supervisee can, and when they should do it? Does it come naturally as the supervision progresses? How do you deal with that?
Well, let's start with that issue first of all. No, I don't think it comes naturally at all. Indeed, I think there's a number of issues around with this. One of them takes us back to the original point I made earlier, which is that basically people have different ideas about what supervision is and how it should be conducted. You know, if those ideas are not shared by supervisor and supervisee, then there are going to be difficulties. So, you know, in one sense, you're quite right, it is about ground rules. It's about, you know, what's to be mutually expected of each other in this relationship. How do we conduct this relationship? What sorts of things is it valid to be talking about? But equally, can I say, what sorts of things is it not valid to be talking about? So those are some of the sort of boundary issues, I think. I think there's sort of other questions that crop up, which is that I think that the longer any relationship tends to go on, you tend to find that boundaries tend to become more permeable. And let's face it, you know, just as an intimacy can develop, you know, in the nature of the relationship between a client and a practitioner, there's an intimacy that can develop between a supervisor and supervisee. And, you know, very often, if you're not careful with that, you know, there can be semi-assumptions that actually this is a bit like a friendship. And yeah, it's a bit like a friendship. And when I think that someone in that relationship feels the need to say something which the other party in the relationship is not going to like, that can be quite disturbing. So it will be far better to have some clarity right at the beginning about what it is we're supposed to be doing and what we can expect from each other. But also, I would argue that there should be periodic reviews of that relationship, because, as I say, I think the longer it goes on, the more prone it is to drifting. And also, I mean, the other thing is that needs change. My needs as a supervisee change over time. So, you know, if we've sort of discussed and agreed what it is that we're trying to get out of this relationship now, I would probably suggest that what I need out of this supervision relationship as a supervisee in 12 months' time, 24 months' time, is going to be potentially quite fundamentally different. So it needs to be renegotiated and refocused on. Yeah.
Interesting. As you've mentioned the time, just a question popped up in my head. Is it useful to change your supervisor from time to time?
Well, I think I'm a general believer in the idea that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The answer in some ways is a bit more complicated than that, because I'm not necessarily wedded to the idea that the different functions of supervision need to all be provided by the same person. I think it's possible to split them off. And indeed, I know, you know, if we come back to that issue, for instance, of group versus individual, I think that quite commonly happens, that you know, there are some functions dealt with in one forum and some dealt with in the other. But the only thing I would say is, if you do split off, then I think you've got to have good communication again about who's doing what, or who and what people think the other party is actually doing. So that's one thing. Should you change them automatically? Well, I think there's an interesting question about what do you do if you don't have a good working relationship with your supervisor. I mean, where do I start with that? I think most people working privately tend to assume it's straightforward, that you just change the supervisor. But I think that's based on a rather false consumerist model of supervision. There's this idea that there's this whole shelf of different highly competent supervisors, and if you don't like one, you pop them back and can take another. But actually, in reality, I'm not sure it actually works out like that very well. I think there are lots of instances, for example, where finding the best supervisor, quote unquote, is actually quite tricky. So at one level it is easier to change, but it's not that straightforward, and I think it's quite a big decision. I think anyone, for example, who's been in private supervision and their supervisor retires, I've known a couple of people where they've gone through agonies trying to find a new supervisor that they feel happy with. In an organizational perspective or a training perspective, I think it can get even trickier. I mean, I'll say a little bit on the course about a grandparenting role in supervision. And often organizations, particularly probably these days, actually, in fairness, if I'm honest, probably I only ever see it these days in training organizations, will have an identified grandparent figure. So this is somebody who, at least hypothetically, the supervisor, or more commonly the supervisee, can go to in the event of irresolvable dispute. It's not perfect, and I've known a lot of folk who have had difficulties with the reality of how that works. But I think that, you know, if you are, let's take a trainee, because they are the most vulnerable, really, in a sense. If I'm somebody in training, and for whatever reason, I am not having a successful relationship with my supervisor, maybe I've even tried to raise ways in which we could resolve this. Maybe and it's not got anywhere, or maybe I just don't feel I've got the courage to, for goodness sake. This person's going to potentially end up determining my future. They're going to write a report, a training report on me, you know, and how many bad things am I going to say with someone who's going to do that? So I think you should at least have a reference point in terms of a grandparent that you can potentially go to. But I think that, you know, changing in employee environments, changing supervisors might not be viable. You know, the way the supervision is set up, it may be occurring within a single department. It may actually be automatically, and I know a lot of people aren't happy about this, but there's a reality that for some people it may automatically be attached to a managerial role. Or alternatively, there's nobody else in the department that can do it. So it's tricky. It's a tricky issue, particularly within employed environments, I think.
Okay, Cashel is mentioning peer supervision, and I can see there is a question from Nikki.
Yeah.
I would be interested in your ideas about the boundaries between restorative supervision, restorative supervision for peer supporters and group therapy when the work triggers their own experiences. Sorry.
Right. No. I think I understand what Nick is saying. Okay. Well, let's get a few things clear, really. If we were to go back to at least the early 1980s, the BAC, as it was called at the time, which is now the BACB, but the BAC, as it was called at the time, actually made a very strong statement that supervision is not counselling. And that's actually an interesting boundary issue, actually. And, you know, and one of the reasons why I think they made that statement was that for a lot of counsellors, they felt like they were drifting into a semi-counselling, semi-therapeutic relationship. And that is not the purpose of supervision. So to directly address that issue that Nikki's raised about work triggers, I guess I would say two things on this. I think that, you know, there's the issue as it affects you as an individual supervisee. You know, something happens, I've got a past experience, something happens in work and it makes me feel bad and it needs to be addressed. Okay, and on that particular basis, I would say that the supervisor ought to be actively encouraging the supervisee to go and seek that help and support, but to seek it externally to the supervision relationship. There is a secondary question here, however, which is, I'm going to put this in a fairly blunt, crude way, which is, am I able to continue doing the job? You know, this impact it's had on me. Is this something which is impacting on me so much that actually I need to find a way of dealing with it in order to ensure it doesn't adversely affect the work I'm doing? So in a sense there, what we're talking about is the effect of the trigger on the work rather than the effect on the the practitioner for their own sake. And there, I think the supervisor has a role, but I think it's quite a prescribed role, which is, I think the supervisor has a role, first of all, of helping people to explore and develop ways of managing that and coping with it, and boundarying it, sorry to bring that word up again, boundarying it again in the work that they're doing. But I wouldn't see the role of the supervisor as being that of resolving it. The resolving of the issue needs to be occurring outside in a different relationship. But, you know, the next question is, well, what do I do if I can't successfully boundary this particular work? And the brief answer is to that, it is straightforwardly a competency issue. You know, it's exactly the same as if I had a physical illness, and, you know, I can't boundary my physical illness in a way which stops interfering with me doing the job I need to do. I'm just not at that point in time sufficiently competent, and so I have to withdraw. What I think, I'll be honest with you, I think it's very bad news if supervisors feel drawn into, in a sense, holding the supervisee whilst they continue to do the work, whilst this issue is not being managed within the work, because it will alter the relationship. You know, there's no two ways around it. If I'm going to get into the business of helping someone to work through or resolve a past issue because it's been triggered and come to light with work, the nature of our relationship is going to shift. Now you might say, well, fair enough. Well, yeah, you can say fair enough, but let me make these points. Number one, you're going to spend increasingly less time talking about the clients. And the supervision is there, I would argue, fundamentally for the clients. It's not fundamentally there, I would argue, for the supervisee. And secondly, what are you going to do if this particular issue, in a sense, is having a serious impact on the supervisee, which you might not discover until maybe a few months down the road, when you then discover that I'm drinking, for instance, and that this then becomes much more of a serious issue. And the shift that will be required in our relationship at that point, I think, is incredibly difficult. And I've known a number of supervisors over the years who started off with giving a message to supervisees, which was, any problem, any time, come to me. And then they get handed something and they're getting, to be blunt with you, sucked into it. And they are then trying to find a way out of it because they're actually conscious of the fact that they could be colluding, but they feel absolutely bad about taking some sort of action over it. And yeah, it's not a desirable place to be in. So to be honest with you, again, I would emphasize the idea that all of this boundary stuff should ideally really be negotiated right at the beginning of the relationship, to try and prevent those sort of dangers occurring. So yeah.
Paul, lots of people are asking, not necessarily tonight, but I know it's often a question about what to disclose, what not to disclose, what is confidential, what is not confidential in supervision. I don't want you to go very far with it. Just a question, do you cover that issue in your training?
Yes, of course. Absolutely crucial issue.
Right, right.
Can I say, well, I'll say one thing. I won't give away the whole package, but one thing I would say is, I would advocate very strongly the idea that, with a couple of exceptions, thoughts and feelings should be absolutely confidential within supervision. Thoughts and feelings.
Actions are not.
Actions is where it gets more complicated. Behavior is where it gets more complicated. But thoughts and feelings, with just a couple of quite extreme exceptions, I think should always be treated that way. And that, just to go a bit further on that, no, I won't go a bit further on that because I will get drawn into it. We do look at that in quite a lot of detail. Yeah.
I'm just very aware of time. Yeah. And another question I wanted to ask, lots of people, although they're interested in theory, they would want to learn some skills. So
Sure.
other specific skills which you will be covering in the courses?
Yes,
and
yes, there are specific skills,
okay.
And there's also, and those are from different approaches, and there are different ways of approaching supervision and different ways of approaching case discussion as well, which we will be going through, and which I can't guarantee that everybody will have the opportunity to practice all of them. Some of them will be described, but you will have an opportunity certainly to practice a reasonable selection of them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Nice comment from Linda about the fact, Linda is saying that one of her supervisors specializes in children and young people, and another one specializes in adults, and it works very well for her because it improved her practice, obviously. Yeah. Seeing two different perspectives. And I think that's what you were saying, sometimes having different angle during supervision. I also wanted to mention, and I've forgotten what I wanted to mention. I think it was about, yes, it was about supervision with Paul. Paul is offering supervision for supervisors one-to-one on Zoom, and I've put the link in the chat slightly earlier on. I'll try to put it in again. So if you are interested in having supervision with Paul, please have a look on that website. And
can I just emphasize that point, that at this point in time, I have capacity for the supervision of supervision, but I'm not directly supervising anybody additional at the moment. I haven't got any further capacity for that. Okay. Supervision of supervision, yes.
Yes, supervision of supervisors rather than them as therapists. So if you're interested, please have a look. And I have a feeling I wanted to say something else, but it completely escaped it. I think there is another question from Nikki. It's a comment. Can I ask whether the course covers supervising work other than therapeutic works, for example, supervision for researchers?
It doesn't. It is specifically for therapeutic work. Having said that, I would probably say that something like about 80% of it is fairly easily transferable to other environments. And to be blunt with you, if you are having problems on the course, seeing how that transition works, I'd be more than happy to outline it in more detail if you want to catch me during the course, and I will talk about what bits need modifying, which bits are the same, basically. Yeah, but I would say probably about 80% of it is applicable to both.
Thank you. And I remembered what I wanted to say. For everyone who attends our essential supervision skills or advanced supervision skills, as you know, we now run tutorials. At least it will be at least once a year tutorial for everyone who attended supervision courses. They are free tutorials for those who've done them to keep up to date, because Paul updates the courses and he's very happy to share with you all the updates he's done during the last year. So you can come to the tutorial and be updated, and that's absolutely free. So thank you very much. We will stop for the summer. We won't put you through this torture again when the weather is so nice and you're sitting in front of the computer. So we'll have a break for the summer. We'll see you again in September. And as always, you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and have a wonderful summer break. I hope it will be all great for you. Bye.
Thanks very much, folks. Thanks for coming. Look after yourselves.
Bye.
Take care. Good to see some faces here earlier on this week. Thank you.
And next week.
Yeah, next week. Oh, it was next week as well. Right. Okay, we'll see you there as well.
See you next week.
Take care. Look after yourselves.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.